barely hear you. You're breaking up a little bit. Say, how are you?
I'm doing well. Can you hear me better? Should I put on my micro headset?
This is perfect now.
Okay.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. I really, really appreciate this. The way these conversations work, I start out by asking you just a simple question to tell me your name and share anything you want to share so we can get to know you. And we go from there.
So my name is Ryke Longest, and I'm currently serving as a co-director of the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. I've lived in North Carolina nearly my entire life, and I love what I do.
Excellent. You being in charge of the Environmental Policy Center, what does it mean? Do you have classes, or do you go around the country helping people understand how to deal with pollution and destruction of the outdoors, if you will?
Yeah, it's a little of both. So the clinic that we run, Michelle Nolan and I are co-directors now. I started as the initial director of the clinic, and then over time, Michelle was promoted to become co-director last year. And so we are now jointly sharing the responsibility of administering the clinic. And it's a course, and it's also a law firm. But it's more than a law firm, it's also a consulting firm, because we have students from the law school and also from environmental sciences, primarily master's students at the Nicholas School of the Environment, also PhD students that are associated with that program, and then occasionally graduate students from other disciplines will also enroll on the Nicholas School side of things. The design of the clinic is to use service as a teaching mechanism. So we not only are running a course, but we're also teaching the students how to work with clients. And that's one of the distinctive things about a clinic versus some of the other things we do at the law school and the Nicholas School. I serve on both faculties. My primary appointment was the law school. I have what's called a secondary appointment at the Nicholas School. And then, as you mentioned earlier about going around the country and working with folks in communities who have environmental or conservation concerns, that is exactly what we teach students how to do and what we do in the clinic as part of our public service mission. So we have the educational mission and the public service mission, and the students participate with us in that. And that causes us to work in communities both in North Carolina, but also around the country and occasionally around the world. Working in other countries is much more challenging, and we've only done it a few times. We have worked in Brazil. We have worked in Nigeria, and we have been thinking about working in some other countries around the world, but what we have generally found is that working in other countries presents a lot of issues. Also, there's a lot of environmental and conservation issues that are right here locally. We've worked in Alabama, we're currently working in Virginia, and we've worked some in other states in the Southeast, as far south as Florida. We work with community groups, try to work with community groups that have a real need for a combination of legal services and environmental consulting services. So the students who are working with us as Nicholas School students, they're really working as trainee consultants. They're learning to do the kinds of things that environmental consultants do once they graduate and get their professional life started. And so an example of that kind of synergy would be one of the cases that we worked on very early on was in a rural county in northeastern North Carolina that is called Gates County. Gates County is east of Durham. It's about almost a 2-hour drive. It's about an hour and 40 minutes from Durham to places in Gates County where we were meeting. We were working with a community that lived in an unincorporated part of the county. So there was no municipal government. And in fact, the community in which we were working was a community that was a group of citizens consisting of the descendants of white farmers and plantation owners who had lived in the community, and also the descendants of enslaved people who had been living in the same community. That was threatening their community was the location of a Navy facility that was proposed, referred to as the outlying landing field. this would have been a jet runway in the middle of a very rural part of the county. It was actually going to go divide up this community called the Sandbanks community right in half with this long runway. But it wasn't going to be an airport that was going to receive regular traffic. Instead, it was going to be an airport that was designed just to do practice takeoff and landing by naval aircraft carrier pilots. So that means that instead of having air traffic coming in, every, let's say, 5 or 6 times a day and having a landing and then having a takeoff, these would be 5 and 6 hours at a time, continual buzzing by planes, taking off, hitting the runway, and then not actually landing, but accelerating again and speeding back off and circling back around to run again. It was going to be, we basically characterized it after we got some help from our Nicholas students looking at it as a noise dump. So this community, that it was a nice, quiet, and peaceful community in which many people had buried their ancestors and had lived for hundreds of years, is going to be disturbed by all this noise and the pollution that came with it. Because with the jets coming, it wasn't just the noise; it also included air pollution. It also included the pollution associated with the dumping of fuel. Sometimes, if the jets are too full when they get there, of jet fuel, they'll just dump the fuel in the air in order to avoid having a problem when they hit the ground.
That makes sense. So we've talked many, many times about pollution and about the climate and various things in the environment of this world that we currently occupy. And I know at one time you expressed concern whether some of the great work you had been able to accomplish over time is being reduced or making situations not so survivable for humans. Can you talk a little bit about what is pollution, the types of pollution, and the impact of pollution and debris and all that stuff, not only in our oceans and among our trees, but anywhere in our society? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's important because one of the things, I guess I've been doing this, I'm about to get just a little while longer. I've been doing this for 30 years. And during that period of time, there was period of time when I began to get really depressed as I began to learn about more and more sources of pollution and the presence of pollution around us. I began to become a little bit depressed about the fact that it almost seems insoluble, the amount of pollution that's already in our natural environment, and it can be found everywhere. That information, the more information that we get from science, that story gets worse every day. What does get better, I think, is people's understanding of the ways in which these things are interrelated. And I think what's also important that makes me feel less depressed is to see the dedication of the students that I see coming through who want to make this world a better place and want to create systems, because these are about systems really, systems that will do a much better job of reducing and eliminating these sources of pollution. Some of the ones that we face that we know, I'll give an example of some where we've done a pretty good job really quickly. In the United States, we made a very serious effort in the last 100 years to eliminate waterborne illness through the treatment of wastewater. And as much as millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, really billions of dollars, have been invested in eliminating untreated sewage being dumped directly into surface waterways, which has also greatly reduced preventable death by ingesting contaminated water, especially with bacterial contamination. That being said, we haven't eliminated it. So one of the problems that we find in the United States is because of persistent poverty, because of persistent racism, because of persistent gaps that we have in our federal system that's supposed to be helping folks out, we still have, even with things like wastewater treatment, gaps. So there are places in the United States where there's inadequate treatment of wastewater, and that's resulting in people catching diseases that were very common in the 1800s, but were nearly eliminated in the 1900s. They're not eliminated entirely. There are places where those things still exist. So there's conventional pollution like that.
We see a resurgence of what was at one point eliminated has now come back into play now.
That's right. And that is one of my concerns because, it's expensive to invest in those kind of infrastructure, but the long-term cost of avoiding making those changes can be catastrophic. When we see what we have now, lead contamination is a good example. It took a long time for the United States to get wise about banning lead from gasoline. This morning, I was on a call for the PhD defense by a student who was in our clinic. Her research was at Duke in a Bass Connections class, looking at soil samples in Durham in the community for lead. And she found patterns all around Durham, basically any place where there was high traffic volumes back in any time from the 1920s through the 1970s in Durham. The areas along those roadways, the ground, the grass, and the areas around those roadways, they're all contaminated very heavily with lead. And her research was really interesting because it does show something that's invisible to the naked eye, but is a legacy of pollution. Now, we've done a good job of getting rid of the source of lead, but it still hangs around. And then the other piece of the puzzle is that some of the things that are still sources of lead, we haven't gotten around to fixing. And this is where I do feel like the backsliding is really important, like critical, is things like water supply lines in homes, where people are drinking every day water that's contaminated with lead. They may not know it. And the way in which we pay for water infrastructure in the United States creates a huge gap because we expect homeowners or renters or landlords to brunt all of that cost. And, as far as public services go, we don't do that with other public services. We don't say you've got to build the road in front of your house. But certainly when it comes to the connection, that's what we're saying. You've got to pay for that for yourself. And a lot of people can't afford that, and that creates terrible problems. Yeah. So with the backsliding, another issue that I have noticed is that, because we've been successful on some pollution, the pollution we haven't been successful with, it's easy to sort of feel like, oh, we've done enough on that problem. Let's move on to something else, which is not to say we don't have other pressing problems. We do. But I think that then leads to people not actually wanting to know what are some of the other polluting problems that we have out there. And then something will come along and people will realize that something's very bad is happening. In North Carolina in the last few years, that happened with coal ash. Just a couple of years ago, that happened with something called perfluorinated compounds, often referred to as PFAS or PFOA. It's a family of chemicals. They are artificial chemicals that have made their way into lots of different consumer products, so many so that we don't even realize how often we are exposed to them. And we are finding that these chemicals don't break down easily. They're long-lived in the environment. They're not healthy. They're dangerous to humans, and in some places they're really becoming a real problem for drinking water. And these are what we refer to as emerging contaminants. So we have problems that we got close to solving but didn't solve, waited that last 10% out, and now that everything is growing even worse. And then we've got new problems that we have to solve. So it is going to take new investment to make that work.
Yeah. Before we talk about underserved communities, I want to ask you about the melting glaciers. So it has been in the news a lot that glaciers that have been in existence for millions of years are starting to melt. Why is that?
Yeah, so that the short answer can be reflected in a commonly shown diagram of the temperature changes over time in the history of in recorded history, and then going back using things like ice cores and other historical data sets to try and determine what temperature was like in long ago. And there have been, this is what we now was referred to as global warming for a while, and then it became referred to as climate change. So global warming is the trend. Climate change is, if you were to draw a Venn diagram, I'd put global warming as the forcing agent, but it's a subset of climate change. And it is forcing climate change. So the reason we see the glaciers receding fundamentally is that those are large accumulations of ice and snow accumulated over thousands of years, some of which date back to the time of the Ice Age, and it's still not really fully melted. There was a time during the Ice Age in North America when glaciation came as far south, nearly to Durham, around Durham. We weren't fully glaciated in the way areas further north of us were, but glacial extent did come down this far. And but the glaciation that we're seeing now is, in recent history, glaciers that have been stable for 50, 100 years are rapidly melting. Not just glaciers, but also frozen soil or tundra that is referred to as permafrost. It was referred to as permafrost by soil scientists and by geologists because it was understood to always be frozen. As permafrost melts, as glaciers melt, they release water that has been trapped in a frozen state, and also gases that have been trapped along with it that have been held up for thousands and thousands of years. And this is all the result of global warming. The global warming is driven almost entirely by pollution created by human activity. So whether it's the use of fossil fuels to run automobiles, whether it's the use of fossil fuels to produce energy for electricity. Some of our farming practices also contribute to that. More methane in the atmosphere, more nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. These are also greenhouse gases, what are referred to as greenhouse gases. And then there's some artificial chemicals that are very potent greenhouse gases. They're in much smaller quantities. They're generated in much smaller quantities, but they're very powerful and potent. So those are all the things that are forcing that. And that is, of course, causing devastation for ecological systems. So anything that is a migratory animal that's depending on the permafrost to support its weight, they're not going to be able to support weight anymore. Anything that is dependent upon the glacial melt to provide a nice, clear, clean, slow-moving stream. Those streams are not slow-moving anymore. They're rapid. So a lot of these ecosystems are really changing. And then people are also losing out, especially when we see communities in Alaska and other places in the northern climates where indigenous populations have been living on permafrost, and then the permafrost melts and their foundations of their houses just utterly sink. And so they have to move. Sometimes entire villages can be swallowed up.
Yeah. Okay, one more question before we get to the tough stuff. Let me ask you this. So a few years ago, we heard that there was this gaping hole in the ozone layer. But over time, they have been able to narrow that hole in the ozone layer, which protects us from radiation and all types of other things. Can you talk a little bit about what the ozone layer is and what does it mean for it to the hole to be increased and to resume it to a normal human protection ozone layer?
Yeah. So this is an interesting chemical because ozone is just another form of oxygen. It just happens to be a chemically supercharged form of oxygen. The normal form of oxygen that we encounter when we breathe every day is the O2. That's what we are breathing in. And ozone is supercharged, and it has, at ground level, we actually produce a lot of ozone in our urban areas, especially in the summer. And in fact, you will see alerts, air quality alerts in places like the Research Triangle that will be triggered when ground level ozone is too high. And that's because at ground level, ozone is a lung irritant. So anyone who has asthma or has any kind of lung sensitivities, those are exacerbated. And even people who aren't experiencing asthma, their lung function will be aggravated by this very active chemical we call ozone. Mm-hmm. That which is dangerous at ground level, and it's formed during the summer because it's a reaction between pollution that's produced by the cars that we drive and the buses that we take or the trucks that deliver our products, and naturally occurring chemicals that are released by trees and heat. Those three factors together are what's producing ozone. So ozone is being produced in the environment through natural processes as well. For example, thunderstorms. But so ozone itself is constantly being created, both by polluting things that we do and also through natural processes. But what happens at the ground level is dangerous to people, but what happens in the atmosphere is protective for people. So that's what got really weird about the ozone hole, was that ozone at the surface of the atmosphere was dangerous for people, for plants, and for animals. But at the stratosphere, so the very upper level of the atmosphere, is really critical. Ozone down here, bad for us. Ozone way up here was very good for us. And what it was doing is that reactivity, that's also problematic below, was helping a great deal to deflect some of the energy that was associated with radiation that otherwise would penetrate through. So the ozone hole became a great concern because it was observed at the poles, and there was a concern that it was growing. These ozone holes were growing. And so that, for example, all of us would be suffering from it to an extent, but those who were in very high or low latitudes were going to suffer the most. So Australians were projected to have significant impacts from this. People living in South America were projected to have significant lifetime cancer impacts from this. The good news is, this is one of the great examples where international environmental law actually was victorious, working with industry to eliminate ozone depleting substances. So the reason we had an ozone hole is almost entirely due to the production of a certain class of chemicals, chlorofluorocarbons, and the CFCs. And so what we saw was that once a treaty was signed, international treaty obligation to address the ozone depleting substances, nearly all the countries in the world worked very aggressively to go ahead and take action to reduce those. And so in the United States, we just stopped producing them. And in most other countries, they shifted all the processes that were being used, that were being driven by these chemicals with other chemicals that did not destroy the ozone in the atmosphere. And so these were chemicals that typically were like propellants. So we often think of a spray can, the things that were coming out of spray cans and out of related processes, lifting up into the stratosphere, destroying the ozone up there. Once we stopped contributing to that problem, the ozone hole stopped getting larger and actually started to get smaller. So we're in a much better place there than we were 20 years ago. And that is, one of the examples of something that makes me feel hopeful about the future. We can think about how we could maybe apply the lessons learned from that to others. The difficulty is that the industries that were producing that chemical were all interconnected and had an incentive. I'm not sure that we've yet figured out a way to make that work for carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases, but it does make me hopeful that we can collectively, on a planet-wide basis, actually make meaningful contribution. So, great question.
So here's the terrible questions. First,
Okay.
I want you to explain to me, how does a city like Flint have water problem for the majority of their citizens? How is that? And I'm sure it's related to something you said earlier about water treatment plants and things of that nature. But how do we have a Flint?
Yeah, so that Flint is a combination, I think, of at least 3 major failures of governance. Number one was declining customer base. So a lot of these water and sewer systems in the United States, one of the ill effects of the way that we've structured our governmental system is that local government has primarily taken over the role of handling water and wastewater treatment. And so if local government goes out of business, for lack of any better term, or has real difficulties, then one of the most important aspects of living in a civilization is taken away from people, and that is the ability to have clean drinking water that's reliable, and to have waste services, so to get rid of waste products in a clean fashion. So, the United Nations recognizes now water and sanitation as a basic human right. I think that was long overdue. It only happened within the last decade. And Flint is an example where a local government that had that responsibility began to lose the resources that it needed to take care of that responsibility. The industries closed down, people lost their jobs. When you rely on water and sewer infrastructure, where people are paying the bills, especially for a town like Flint, you're relying on two kinds of customers, right? One will be the employees or retired folks or folks who are living in the community and who are supported by other means, paying their water bill to help keep the system up. You're also going to rely on industrial customers, companies, businesses, restaurants. And in a lot of places, and in most places of which I've spent any time looking, that's where they make most of their money. And it's not a profit center, it's a revenue center. But we've seen the problem in Flint play itself out in lots of other states on this point, which is they lost a lot of revenue they needed to make the system run properly. So you had folks that were trying to run the water and sewer system but did not have the resources they needed to run it. The second form of failure there was that government, which came in, made bad, very bad decisions without regard to the health and safety of the people living in Michigan. And what we see there is, to save money, they moved from buying treated water from the city of Detroit to restarting a water treatment plant they had in Flint, but drawing their water from the Flint River, which was much more acidic. The result of that was that they basically conducted an experiment with the population of Flint of changing their water from the Detroit water to this more acidic water coming from the Flint River. The problem there was the acidic water would come through the pipes and dissolve material that was along the interior of these pipes. And that included material that was preventing the spread of lead throughout the system. Yeah. The acidity of the water was so bad that General Motors plant, there was a plant that manufactured automobile parts that was still using Flint water. Within a few months of the switch, that plant insisted that they had to change the water because it was tearing their parts up. So we're talking about water that was so bad that the auto parts were being corroded. The city of Flint did not take that as a signal to rescue the people of Flint or worry or concern about them. So that was a red flag. They actually got a loan from the state of Michigan to build a pipeline to connect the Dearborn, the auto plant, the Flint the GM auto parts plant to another water supply so that they would not have rusty parts. But the same acidic nature of that water that was making the auto parts go bad was making the pipes all throughout Flint go bad. And that was the second failure. And the third failure was the failure of oversight by state and federal officials. In our system, we have to have the local government paying for things, and we have to have local government elected officials keeping their eye on the best public interest of all the citizens. Both of those things failed here. But our fail-safe is supposed to be the state and federal minimums under the Safe Drinking Water Act. The Safe Drinking Water Act was enacted as one of the environmental laws, one of the things that we teach in our environmental law courses, and it was designed to ensure that anybody who's supplying water to the public, and that could be, a city, it could be as small as a truck stop, which is serving hot dogs and sodas to people on the highway. As long as you're serving customers in the public, you are a public water system, and you're required to do sampling and monitoring for pollutants, and you're required to tell your customers about those reports and make those available. And you're supposed to be on the lookout for problems like the ones that popped up in Flint. And unfortunately, both at the state level and at the federal level, when these problems were brought to their attention, the officials, instead of being worried about the people of Flint and what was happening to them, were concerned about not overreacting and saying, well, maybe these tests need to be rerun. Maybe these are just anomalous, and let's wait and see if the tests also show problems later on. So the sad truth is that the Flint problem was discovered by the whistle was blown on it by a pediatrician who was noticing huge spikes in blood lead levels in children. And that shouldn't be it. We shouldn't be using our kids to be our environmental screening tools. And that's a failure. I wish I could say that Flint's the only place where that's true. It's not. We don't know the full extent of all the other places in the United States where people are being exposed to dangerous levels of lead. It is an issue that we work on. My colleague, Michelle Nolan, the co-director who works with me, she and students have actually been working on a project with a group called NC Child that has led to reducing the state's blood lead level, action level, and also in developing policies to try and expand testing so that we cover other parts that aren't covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act to make sure that our children aren't being exposed, like daycare centers. So if you have a home daycare center that's only serving, 4 or 5 kids at a time, that's technically not going to be subject to the Safe Drinking Water Act. Too few people are coming in contact, but of course that's a very sensitive population. And we want to see more testing in schools and other places to make sure that we're not, feeding our school children lead.
I want to ask you a question, and I want to link 3 things together, and I want to tell you a story, and I don't know whether you saw this or knew this. It was an African family had moved to America, and they were living in an apartment complex, and I don't know how old it was. I don't know anything. And the youngest child, I think, may have been 2 or 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Did not have enough food. The family did not have enough food. They were barely making it. Began to eat the paint off the apartments. You were picking it off and eating it. And so no one else in the family had gotten as sick as she had. So first they started thinking, well, it was something that came from Africa, or that's something that she had experienced. But they finally found out it was the lead in the paint that she was eating because it tasted good and she was hungry. And eventually she died. So that example, Flint, then you have McDougal Terrace here in Durham, where you have carbon monoxide poisoning happening to people who live in apartments. And then you have these examples of, in mostly Black communities, where the garbage dump center is.
Yep.
Is that, and I don't even know if I want to say this word this way, is that racist behavior, or is that just, here's the community who's going to make the least noise?
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. My tendency, especially when we're talking about things anywhere where there was Jim Crow enacted, and so throughout the South, and even in places in the North, and we see patterns of segregation, the problems you're describing always worse in communities that have been redlined and restricted for non-white people. And so it's clear to me that that is racism. So when we see because it's a completely a symptom of the racist system. So the small town where I lived in until I was 8 years old was called Rose Hill. The street on which I lived, Ridge Street, went to the railroad tracks. It was paved. We had running water. We had sewer. You crossed the railroad tracks. The street was unpaved. There was no running water. There was no sewer system. There was no garbage collection. Still the same community, but it was out of town. And it was a different, the street name changed. It went from being Ridge Street to Yellowcut. And Yellowcut Road out in the county was the road where Black folks lived. And that is racism, clear racism. It was de jure, what we call de jure segregation. The town itself had said, we're gonna put the town limits here, and this is where Black folk can live. And you can find this pattern all across the United States. You don't have to just go in the South, but you don't have to go far. Find it in Durham. You find it in Mebane, North Carolina. So one of the groups that I've worked with in the past is called the West End Revitalization Association. Omega Wilson might be somebody you might want to speak to there, who's actually done great historical work on what these patterns are called.
What did you say her name was?
His name is Omega Wilson.
Okay.
And Brenda Wilson. And I'll send you a link to their organization.
Okay, I appreciate that very much.
Sure. So I think that is right. I'll just say it right out front. I think that is racism. The issue of paint is also environmental injustice. Sometimes that's an issue of environmental injustice for people who are just in poor situations. So that is to say, poor white folks also were ingesting paint chips in a lot of contexts as well. But certainly it's disproportionately impacting Black folks.
Yeah. So this is my last question, and I'll leave it for you to talk. I just want to remind you, I told you to watch One Strange Rock. I hope you've been able to find it and watch it. It is phenomenal. It is, I mean, every time I watch it, sometimes I have the series DVR'd, and I watch it over and over and over and over again. And it talks about the formation of Earth and what we're doing to it and what's not happening, what's good happening, and so forth and so on. So my last question is this. So we had the fires in Australia. We had the tree cuttings over in I can't think of the forest, the great forest where the animals were. Um, my brain is slow a bit, but I'm sure it'll come.
Amazon, the Philippines, there's
Amazon,
lots of
in the
places.
Amazon, in
Yeah.
the Amazon, and you have all these places where money takes precedent over life, and I mean even life such as animals. Where they had to get the little I can't remember what you call it, the little I want to say it looks like a bunny rabbit with white ears. I think they grow in China or somewhere, but we've all been given one. I mean, like somewhere that life takes precedence over. I mean, money takes precedent over life.
Yeah, that's a major concern. And I tend to think that what that means is that folks have stopped really paying much attention to their relationship to the world around them. I mean, for me, it's as simple as, do you have an attitude of gratitude regarding this earth on which we live? And I don't think that is something that you actually just have as a matter um, of birth. I think it's something you have to learn and acquire. You have to actually develop a taste for it, in part because there's plenty of parts of the planet and of nature that are irritating and annoying. And so it can be easy to sort of focus on those and not on the things that really support us. But all of these systems are important and are providing us with really important services, namely, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink. You can go a long time. I mean, you may not want to go a long time without touching your phone, but a human being can live a long time without touching their phone, not without clean water, not without air. And these things are all being provided by the ecosystems in which we live. And so we're part of this world. We're not separate from it. When I see the conflict between just economic gain, let's say, and the ways in which the earth is providing this nurturing home for us, it just seems to me really silly. It's like somebody going in and thinking that to me, when I see the kinds of exploitation that I'm seeing, it's as if somebody were to say, hey, we're going to get rich. We're going to break into these hotels and we're going to steal all the shampoo bottles and then we'll sell them online.
Yeah.
What? I mean, the value of the hotel is the habitat it provides. The earth is our habitat, and we got to take care of it just like we would want to take care of of a hotel room or a rooming house or anything like that. And to strip it for parts just makes no sense. And in fact, oftentimes when you do that, you may make a little bit of wealth for one person, but you end up that collapses. So the history of my family in this state is my family came here early and they got involved in what's called naval stores, which was meaning that they were in the business of cutting down pine forests and making turpentine and pitch. And those pine forests had taken thousands of years to grow, and they were all cut down within 100 years. And the logs and the turpentine and the pitch were all put on rafts and shipped down the Cape Fear River. And many of them went to Europe and became naval vessels for European fleets. Some of them were in the United States. Some of them became farmhouses and fences and other things here in North Carolina. But once those trees were gone, the bounty they had provided, the shelter they had provided, the services they provided, they're not coming back. Right. And that was very short-sighted. And there are a lot of people in this country that can look at things that their ancestors or even their current neighbors are doing that are similarly short-sighted. And it doesn't really produce long-lasting wealth. It's a extractive industry can produce a boom for a short period of time. And then what you're left with is a degraded landscape that can no longer support anyone in the way that they used to. We're seeing that now globally. When I talk to people who do the kind of work that I do, for example, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, they see deforestation devastating communities. And again, it makes a little palm oil for a little while. Some people make a few bucks, but in the end, the forest that was there before was much more economically productive. And so I think it's usually a short-term problem as opposed to a long-term. What's short-term profitable is oftentimes long-term very detrimental, and that's one of the biggest problems we face.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for this. I always learn so much talking to you, and I miss seeing you in the hallways at the law school. I think the work you do, they should pay you $1 million an hour, because I think it's saving everyone's life. It's not just what you're doing to teach your students or to engage the different communities, but it's just phenomenal work. And the fact that you call it like you see it is even more important, because I don't think you pretty it up just to make someone feel good about themselves, so that's really, really wonderful about you. And I'm so glad I can call you friend and colleague. I hope you will come back and do this again with me, because I have 100 more questions about the environment and what different things mean. I think I'm a tree hugger. I recycle everything. I try to recycle water. That's how bad I am about recycling. But I really hope you'll come back and do this again with me.
Happy to do so, Rochelle, and I feel the same way. The way in which you support our students and our faculty, make it possible to do the things we do, is really appreciated by me and by everyone. And I really do appreciate your candor. And I'm glad that you are taking this initiative, because I've enjoyed seeing the other chats with other faculty and students, including some old students. So that was great to see. Well, it's good to see you, and take care.
You do the same, and go watch One Strange Rock. Watch it.
I will.
Watch the very first episode. I think it's 10 of them. Will Smith is the narrator, but I'm gonna tell you something. It's the astronauts who spent years or months or weeks in space. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal story. The things, how going into space has changed them, but actually the view of the world from space. So I hope you are able to watch it.
Will do. I will definitely do that.
Thank you. And I'm going to send you a link to this to see if I can upload it. So once you watch it, if it's okay with you, I'll upload it. Okay.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Take care, Ryke.
Take care.